instructed to speak into this thing, and this is going to be a challenge because I move around a little bit. I am very happy to be here, especially on Veterans Day. This is a great honor to be able to speak to you and to have a moment with you about these deserving individuals in the battalion. I'd like to thank Pam and Judith for allowing me to use this great library and this great facility. And today being Veterans Day, can I see hands of any vets in the, yes sir? As they say, thanks for your service, but I really mean it. I would just say this about veterans in America. During World War II, over 15 million GIs were inducted. That would have been about 13 to 14% of the total population of America at that time. Today, there are about 2 million service professionals, if that's what you call them, and that's less than 1% of the population. So if you transport your mind back into the World War II era, virtually everyone had skin in the game, as they say. Everybody knew somebody, everybody's family was involved. Today, the connection to veterans is sometimes a little bit more tenuous. But today, I hope we're all thinking that we support, have good feelings about what the veterans have accomplished. I'm the son of a railroader. I railroaded. Judith got it a little bit wrong. My great-grandfather railroaded. It skipped a generation with my grandfather. And my great-grandfather, when my father graduated from high school in '39, my great-grandfather took him to the New York Central shops in Indianapolis, which is the big Western Division shops of the railroad, and got him a job as a machinist apprentice. And so Dad, by 1942, when they were drafted, was a journeyman machinist. And that, of course, was his entree into Uncle Sam's service. I'd like to do some introductions here and take you through this. This is my father and mother. My mother was a farmer's daughter from southern Indiana, and Mom was a registered nurse. She treated war-wounded orthopedic specialty, and she served on the Marion County Draft Board in Indianapolis. And my dad, like I said, was a machinist. He grew up in Indianapolis, and so he was a city boy. She was a farmer's daughter. This is a snapshot of a book called Snaps. This was the book that, as I was a child growing up, I was fascinated with the photography in this book. The memorabilia in this steamer trunk that Dad had that he brought back from India, and especially the photographs in this book. So I kept this with me, and that was the real inspiration for writing the book Reels of War. These are letters that my family wrote. My family wrote 680 family letters between March 41, when they started dating, and August 45. And most of the letters were 6 and 7 pages long. A lot of them were 20 pages long. They were both excellent writers. They were both educated, and punctuation was spot on. And so these letters were key in being able to describe the actual color of what the family was going through during the war. Because they wrote home about, not just missing you and missing, love you so much and that kind of thing. But they wrote home about, how to take care of the Ford automobile, how to, get the packages from Indianapolis to the province of Bengal in India, and so on and so forth. But 680 of these. I also will introduce you here to some of the men in the battalion. This is my lovely wife on the far left, Kathy. And then the men in the background there were all veterans of the 721st Railway Operating Battalion. They had their reunions in upstate New York. So 1999, I started attending, and Kathy and I started attending, And we got to know some of the men in the battalion. And as the years went on, they provided me with original source material. My publisher, the University of Nebraska Press, was enthralled by the idea that I had this original material, which amounted to enlisted men histories of how things unfolded. You have the official history, but you also have the enlisted men's history. So as this book unfolds and the story unfolds, it does so from an enlisted man's perspective. And in the, it's not, strictly speaking, a military history, because if anybody in here has read any of the official military histories of the period, they're very detailed and they're quite concise. This is a story. And so the book uses the feature of vignettes, men speaking to other men and characters speaking to characters. And so while these gentlemen were still alive, and they're all passed away now, I let them know that I'd be writing in their voice because I figured I'd had a chance to get to know them. So the characters in the book are, out of these gentlemen, my father's, and the words are mine. The character, I think, comes through for what that's worth. Kathy says I don't speak enough about these guys. And so I'm trying to pump that up a little bit by telling you, every one of these guys was a card in the deck. I'm not kidding. Had great personality. And one of the things that I learned when I first started working on the railroad as a brakeman in 1974 was that milquetoast personalities didn't make it very far on the railroad. You tended to have to tell people what it is that kept you safe. The railroad wasn't necessarily interested in making you live a long time. They were interested in moving freight. So anyway, all of these gentlemen had passed that test and had great personalities. This one individual is Rocky. I have this up because Rocky was what I call the spark plug in the battalion. Rocky's the guy who would call me at 9:30 at night on a Sunday while I'm working, back when I was in the Machinists and working, and want to know how the book's coming. You know, I probably spent a week out on the road, and you know, Rocky calling, and I go, yeah, no, I got a little bit done this week, rewrote this and that. But he was a spark plug. Now Rocky's passed away. He had a place up in Syracuse, New York, that had on his property an old lumber mill. And he converted the lumber mill into a museum for military artifacts. And so you see Rocky's got this emblem. It is the China-Burma-India shoulder patch emblem. But over here on this side, you can see the models. Those are called bashes. And I'll get into the story about those in a little bit. All right, now I'm going to talk about how this unfolds. My father was drafted in 42, and in November 42, and by December 10, 43, they had trained up the battalion, and they're going to put them on a boat. They put them on a boat in Long Beach, California, sent them all the way around 14,000 miles to Bombay, India. They put them on a boat, no escorts, 6,000 troops, sent them to India. That's the boat. USS, or it's the SS Mariposa. Now the reason they use these passenger ships is because they figured during World War I, they found that if you put them in convoys, they're too slow. The submarines could attack the entire convoy and do a lot of damage. You put them on one of these things that could make 22, 23 knots. They could outrun, especially submarines, but they could also outrun some of the service ships. So this guy was armed with 2 anti-aircraft guns on the wings, and then he had one 5-inch gun on the stern. The standing orders for the Mariposa were, if you come within sighting of an enemy warship, put him on your stern and run. So like I said, this boat was designed for, I think, 2,300 passengers. Had 6,000 GIs on it, and you can imagine they put them on everything from hammocks to, you can imagine. Dad was pretty lucky. He got a stateroom with 6 other staff sergeants. So he was fairly lucky on this boat. But as you read through Rails of War, you see that this was not a pleasant trip. the boat had to conduct a maneuver, zigzagging. So every 6 minutes, the captain changed course of the boat. And that's based on the fact that the Japanese submarines took 8 minutes to target. So as everybody in Maine knows, since everybody here is boaters, it's oftentimes nice to be able to quarter those waves and make your course so that, you know, it's smooth, right? But when you're zigzagging, you don't have that option. You just go wherever it is. And so many of the men were ill. I don't have to tell you how seasickness can affect people. And so the slang for these guys who were ill was railbirds, because they were railroaders and they would go to the rails of the boat and so on and so forth. One of the things that I received that was just fascinating was I've got all of the shipboard newsletters. So while they're on the ship, they created a newsletter with the daily events and all that kind of thing on the boat. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit now about China-Burma-India, and I'll also let you know I can make it through this usually in about a half an hour, and then we'll open up for questions. That just works a little bit easier. But China-Burma-India was one of the theaters that a lot of historians call it the forgotten theater. The Americans had 250,000 troops over there, and it was notable because the old Flying Tigers, people have heard of them. There's the Aviation Volunteer Group in China. You may have heard of Merrill's Marauders, and they were the group that took Missional, which liberated the northern part of Burma. And then, of course, Bridge on the River Kwai. Bridge on the River Kwai, the movie, was a composite of the war crimes of Kimura, who was the Japanese commander, so who was hung after the war because of his war crimes. So without going into this, either of these, the Marauders is covered in the book. So there's detail on the Marauders. And I was telling this gentleman here, when they went into the jungle, okay, the Americans were in India, staging from India. And when they went into the Burmese jungle to capture Missional, they went in February of '44. They came out after they captured in August of '44. It has 100% replacement rate. Not a single person that went into the jungle came out of the jungle because of the jungle. I mean, they fought battles, they fought 50 battles, they won every one of them, but the jungle was the big enemy. All right. So a little bit of history here. China, during the 30s, gets attacked by Japan. Japan has Korea. China, they start to nibble off Manchuria, and then in '37 they invade Beijing, and then they come on down the coast. So here by '39 they've got Shanghai, Taiwan, so on and so forth. By 1942, when Burma falls in May of '42, Japan controls all of the access to China. So you cannot get a ship loaded with freight to a Chinese coast, and you have to keep China in the war. If you're the Allies, this is their strategy, keep China in the war on the side of the Allies, because eventually we're going to kick the Japanese out of China, we're going to go to Korea, stage an invasion of Japan, and beat Japan. That was the strategy. Nobody knew about the bomb, nobody was talking about Tinian, nothing else. So in order to keep China in the war, Chiang Kai-shek was an ally, although he was a slippery noodle. He was the kind of guy that they worried about switching sides. And to keep them in the war, they had to have enough materiel to constitute a 2 million man army in China, which was what Chiang's army in China was. So in order to get that type of a supply line, they needed a lot of things. Here's Burma under Japanese control. There's Calcutta. So they decided that the freight would come into Calcutta. It would move up this railroad over to Lido, India, and then it would be flown from Lido, India This is called flying the hump. Of course, those are the Himalayan mountains, and there are only so many passes through the Himalayan mountains to get to Chongqing, China, to supply the troops of Chiang Kai-shek. So flying the hump was not it was not an assignment you really wanted. General Jean Renoir, who blurbed the cover of my book, is a personal friend. He retired 4-star Commander Northcom. His uncle died flying the hump. And so flying the hump meant that you were going to load up what was essentially a DC-3 with no more than 3 tons of freight and fly through Japanese-infested territory over these mountains in all kinds of weather, land in Kunming, China, and then do it all again the next day. This is no way to supply that big of a force. They were brave people, but it was a tough way to go. So instead, the strategy was this. They bring the freight into Calcutta, and then the freight would go by railroad up to Parbatipur, which is where my father was stationed. And from Parbatipur, it would go all the way around to Lamrat, Handu, Lunding, Mariana, and Lido. And from Lido, they were going to build a road. They were going to tame that portion of northern Burma. I'll talk about that in just a second. So the strategy here is that 14,000 miles of ocean, Calcutta, dangerous railroad, all the way to Lido, and let's build a road through that jungle and get that freight over to China. Here's a little picture of that. I think these were, and somebody can correct me, I think these were called C-46s or something like that. Yeah. Is that what it was? Yeah. But they're essentially the DC-3s, the same basic bones of the aircraft. And you can see how the Lido flying the hump here was Lido to Kunming. Like I said, there's only so many ways over those mountains. And these guys were unarmed. So. They decided to build the Lido Road so that they would take all that freight that the railroaders are providing and that they would take it down this road. And note the town Missional. That's why the American marauders had to capture Missional to take that away from the Japanese. And then they would connect down here to what was called the old Burma Road, the Chinese Burma connection. It's a little bit better picture of it. Lido through Missional and then down to Kunming, China on the old Burma Road. The length of the road was 1,100 miles. The construction of this road was simply amazing, and it's covered in the book. These were jungles that were monsoon, snake-infested, insect-infested, Japanese-infested, headhunters and tigers, and mountains. 1,100 miles. It cost 1,100 soldiers, a man a mile, to build this road. And the battalions that built this road were American construction battalions. And they were 60% African American, 40% white officers. So that construction, plus the contract laborers, you know, the Americans hired a bunch of contractors while they were at war in India and Burma. So that's how the road got built. There's a picture of it, and there's a small convoy. When they initially got the road open, the convoys were 5 and 6 miles long. So it would take 10 days to drive the 1,100 miles, all the way from Lido to Kunming. The supply dump at Lido, India, was 11 miles long and 1 mile wide. That's how much stuff they wanted to move into China. A little picture of their signage there. Somebody could do a book on the very interesting signage during World War II. There was some creative stuff going on, that's for sure. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about India, because when Dad was there, it was still India. Today, where these units were operating is actually Bangladesh, right? So, in 47, India became the India we know, and then in 71, Bangladesh separated out. And I'm going to talk a little bit about India here, just to give you a little bit of background. But these are a indication of the British troop, or excuse me, the Japanese troop concentrations. And a lot of the material on India, I didn't realize until I started doing the research that India was bombed during the war. India had they attacked Calcutta, Ceylon, other places. And India is a very populous nation, we all know that. It's also an extremely diverse nation in terms of nationalities and religions. And this all plays because the GIs show up in January of 44, and they're going to take over the railroad. The command structure at that time had designated that Americans would take over the railroad in India because the existing railroad just simply couldn't handle it. And the Americans decided that they were going to work with the Indians as best they could, and so on and so forth. So the Indian shop, that is like in my dad's machinist shop, had Indian natives of different castes, different religions, and so on and so forth. But just a real rough sketch of India, you know, you have your Hindus, and they break down into all kinds of different sects, if you will, and the Muslims, and you have your Sikhs, your Parsis, your Jains, there's even some Christians. So you've got all kinds of different religious and national bases. Plus, in the Hindi system, you still have the caste system. So if you were born into a caste, that's where you lived for the rest of your life. Well, the reason why that made things difficult, not just right or wrong, but in the shop, in the Indian shop where Dad and the GIs were working, if you were a machinist journeyman and you had a helper who was of a lower caste, if that helper was going to hand you a tool, he'd make sure that his shadow did not fall on you to give you that tool. So those are just examples of some of the ways that the GIs, and if you read the literature in their own literature and talk to them, they were just frustrated. Because these were hard-charging American GIs. They were ready to go to work, and they took orders just like all GIs, but they also had their own ideas of how things are going to get done. And doing things the Indian way was never going to happen. So it was beneficial for the GIs. You often think it would have been like to be an anthropologist, you know, to watch this whole thing unfold. That was actually the most fascinating thing to me, was to watch the American, if you will, initiative and know-how just move into that culture and make it all happen, because they made it happen. Okay, India, what you see here is a modern-day photograph of the monsoon coming on. Monsoon generally came on about middle May and generally was done end of August, but it could come as early as April and go away as late as October. Monsoon means rain and more rain. That's all it means. So your GI, you're in what they call the malarial plain, which is the area where you're operating in present-day Bangladesh, and you got to run a big old railroad too at the same time. This is the graph that shows the monsoon during the time that they were there in 44. It was actually a heavy monsoon. This depiction down here, I didn't want to use a real photograph. One of the things that I didn't know, all I got when I talked to the men, sometimes they'd say life was cheap. And it was, in a certain sense. The Indian province of Bengal, Bangladesh, was involved in a famine while these GIs were railroaded. And what happened was, when the Japanese took Burma in 42, that rice that used to be surplus and go to Bengal, India, now went to Japanese troops and went to Japan to support their troops. So that rice got cut off. Then at the same time, as the British were retreating from Burma, they burned everything because they didn't want the Japanese to have anything. And then they had these economic dislocations. Then they bombed Calcutta, which was part of the rice distribution network. And then they had two cyclones. Well, the estimations were 6 million Indians passed away in that famine. Not just from starvation, but of course cholera and malaria and all the things that come on with that. So this was the backdrop. This famine lasted from 42 to 46. So all the time the GIs are in theater working, the civilian population is essentially major stress. Indian politics. Okay, so India wanted to be independent. World War II happened, they still wanted to be independent. And the Japanese were hitting them with this propaganda. Asia for the Asians. And actually it had worked in Burma, it had worked in Thailand, that they had support of local populations when they came in with this. And their plan was to create a great East Asia cooperation zone. And you see their little propaganda here with all of the nationalities that are going to be one big happy family under the Japanese colonial rule. So the problem here is, of course, that railroads were extremely political. As in any economy, if you're a rebel force and you want to create havoc for the imperial power, you're going to want to have control of the railroad, because that means they can't move their troops, it means they can't move their economy, so on and so forth. So Indian railroads were political way back, even before the independence movement. The Indian railroads were built in the 1850s by, at the time, the largest infrastructure project on the planet. And the problem that this creates for GIs is saboteurs. So now you have among the population in Bengal, you have saboteurs, known, independence supporters who want to side with the Japanese. And then, when the British lost Singapore, they lost 150,000 troops at Singapore when the Japanese came across. They also lost 40,000 Indians, and that whole group of Indians became a division within the Japanese army under Sandra Bose. So they had an Indian division in the Japanese army. The story with that gets complicated because the Japanese were so racist they hated the Indians too. But, and I hope I'm not offending anybody. This is World War II. We all understand that, right? So we can talk about these things. Now, railroading for Uncle Sam. This is the insignia of the military railway service created during the Civil War, and it means always ready for nation. Dad was a New York Central employee, and his battalion was, quote, sponsored by the New York Central. Well, what does that mean? Because I've been asked that question many times. And the key to understanding it came in a letter that Dad wrote to my mom. What it meant was that in the shop, a supervisor went down a list and said, this guy can go, this guy stays. This guy goes, this guy stays. This guy goes, this guy stays. Because railroaders were war-critical employees. They were exempt from the draft, but yet they needed them in India. So when the New York Central says they sponsored somebody, doesn't mean they paid the bill. They just went down the list and said, you can have this guy stays, this guy, so on and so forth. When the battalion was created, they sent them off for technical training in Camp Cushing, San Antonio, Texas. And I don't know, this is probably the truth, I guess, I'm not sure. San Antonio between May and November. That includes the months of June, July, August, which in San Antonio means really hot. Well, I gotta hope that the Army was smart enough to figure that they're gonna be really hot when they get to India, so we're just conditioning them. But the reason that I have some of these photographs in here is because of this construction. Now, Camp Cushing was about 2 miles from Fort Sam. And of course, Fort Sam is a very big established base, and sometimes called the country club of the Army. But Camp Cushing, there's no record. When I went to San Antonio and talked to the librarians and the historians about the military, record of Camp Cushing, they had nothing on it. The reason is because it was tar paper shacks and a little bit of barbed wire, and they built it right on the double main line of the the Southern Pacific Railroad. So these guys were out in tar paper shacks when it was hot, listening to those damn trains go back and forth, and it could not have been a pleasant experience. Here's a little Army picture of a unit. I don't think this is probably a shift. So, you're on the railroad, you're working 3 shifts. You work around the clock. Now, again, I'm showing you the construction there, and if you can't read this, it says Moonbeam Murphy is a proprietor of the brass rail, this bar, and they're welcoming officers. I don't know which one of these guys is Moonbeam. That photograph is not labeled. A little shoeshine boy outside the gate. Now, these are Army PR pictures too. So these gentlemen are all working on equipment in the shop. So these guys are working on a boiler, or they're staged to look like they're working on a boiler. These guys are working on a driver apparatus for the engine. These guys are working on the wheel sets. The guys, again, they're working on taking the rivets out of a boiler of some kind. So while they were at Camp Cushing, there was a 20-mile march. They left, and they marched overnight, full packs and gear. And they marched them up into the hills around San Antonio, where they had another camp. And this is where they got their chemical warfare training. They did war games, and they were qualified on the range, and so on and so forth. But while they were at camp, they also had a chance to capture Hitler. Now, they're in theater, which means they've made the transit. They've gone to their station in Parbatipur, and this photograph was of the main line entering Parbatipur. This is probably a broad gauge train. Okay, so in India, you have three different gauges, right? You have broad gauge, meter gauge, and even have an even more narrow gauge railroad. So my dad's location in India meant that the big freight that came up from Calcutta off the boat came up on broad gauge railroad. And at Parbatipur, where Dad was located, they took all that freight off the broad gauge rolling stock and they moved it over to meter gauge. Meter gauge being narrower gauge. And then that was the gauge that they used to send it all the way over to Lido. So Dad's operation was not just a railroad yards, a shop operation, but it was also a transshipment operation. Now, I'm showing you this picture because explaining wrecks to people who haven't worked on the railroad, it looks like a mess. Well, according to railroad, it may be a mess, but the mess isn't the problem. The problem is moving traffic. And so if you can move the cars with the crane and get them out of the way, and then rebuild the railroad and move traffic, that's your number one goal. It's not to make it look nice. And in order to do that, you need these. This is a 30-ton broad gauge steam crane. We used to call them hooks. And basically, you just put them out there and move that stuff out of the way, get your clearance, and then move the trains. The gentleman that gave me these photographs, E.O. Woods, was a locomotive engineer. And that first wreck, I think it was 28 cars, and it included the powder that they were using to blast for the Lido Road, ammunition, petroleum, and other stuff. That's what they were moving. This already, for some reason, this fascinated me from the time I was a kid. I grew up on a farm in Indiana, just west of Indianapolis. And Dad was a machinist at General Motors. And he farmed, and we had one of these. We had a 49 Jeep. Had a top end of about 40 miles an hour, but it was good farm equipment. You could go anywhere in it. Well, these guys in Parbatipur have taken the wheels off of a 6-wheel drive Jimmy, and they've mounted the wheels on the Jeep, and it fits exactly into the meter gauge railroad. So now you can run this Jeep on the railroad. The problem is, and they made runs on these things, when you hook what the Indians called the wagons, or the cars, onto this Jeep didn't have any stopping power. It could get it going, but it had no weight, couldn't stop the stuff. So you had to have GIs ride on the boxcars, or whatever you were moving, and to apply the handbrakes. So it was a jerry-rigged situation. They called these things baling wire express. And they also used these when they got to Missional, because Dad's unit sent a detachment down to Missional when the raiders, the marauders took Missional. One of the reasons that they wanted Missional is because it had a railroad connection. And the Japanese buried all of the connecting rods and so on and so forth, and so they had to bring these Jeeps down there and do that. All right. I picture a good friend of my dad's, Stu White. On a railroad, you dispatch with what's essentially called a board, an extra board, little tokens, various jobs. Picture of I just put this in so that you could get a sense of, you know, how a yard might be laid out with your locomotives over here in the ready line, the clean out facility for the locomotives, control tower up here, and then all of your main lines probably going down here. I don't know where the main line was, but just a little. Okay, now these locomotives are getting ready to be serviced. So you're using steam, right? So you've got to clean out the boiler, you got to do a lot of things to keep these things running efficiently. The one reason I wanted you to take a look at this is called a tender car, right? So you got coal up here, and you got water back here. You need both those things to make steam. And you can read this in the book if you like. A blue flag on the railroad means that something's broken. So you put a blue flag on a piece of rail or a car, operating, whatever. And so this was an actual blue flag. And the reason of the blue flag was this. They had put one of these cars, and not particularly, I don't think it was this car, but this type of animal transport behind a tender car. And the elephant had worked the manhole cover loose on the water and take the 1,000 gallons that they had in the tank and sprayed himself with it. And it's all written up in that blue flag. So, of course, without water, you're not going to operate a locomotive because that's really dangerous. But I like this just because this is the unusual quality that these men were dealing with. You know, everything to them was gung-ho, let's get it done, and then boom, you have an elephant car and a crisis. All right, quickly through this, GI lifestyle. There's my dad. He's got particular boots there, very nice leather boots. And he wrote home about the three-way trade he had to make to get those boots. The reason why was because the standard Army Type 1 combat boot was good for maybe a month and a half. They just simply rotted out. Couldn't take the humidity, the moisture, so on and so forth. These were other staff sergeants. And this is a picture of the new camp. Notice I said new. And I always like this picture because you have to remind these anti-authoritarian railroaders that you got to salute these guys when they show up. Now we're going back to the Basha. There were initially, when the Railroad Battalion arrived in January '44, there were 26 of these Bashas. And that's where the British had built these Bashas for the troops to be housed in. And the problem with the Basha, of course, is it is very combustible. On March 25, '44, barely 3 weeks into operating the railroad, their camp burned to the ground, and I mean everything burned to the ground. Sleeping quarters, headquarters, personnel records, you name it. My dad was three of his buddies, there was 4 of them altogether, got a pup tent. Because they're working in 3 shifts, they could now have 2 guys sleeping in a pup tent while the other guy was off working and so on and so forth. They lived like that until they got into some boxcars in the yard, and they stayed there for like 6 months, living out of these boxcars while they were building the camp back up. Not a single train was canceled or delayed during that time. And I asked the men many times, you know, what caused this? Undetermined. Well, I asked them about sabotage. Yeah, we caught some guys doing this and doing that. But it was never determined that this was sabotage. But on a day when the wind was blowing 50 miles an hour in the right direction, you just have to wonder. Okay, rest and relaxation. Here we go. This is the toy train is what they call it. This train is still in service today. 24-inch, I think, rail to rail on this thing. And it goes up to Darjeeling. And one of the best accounts of Darjeeling was Samuel Clemens. You know, Mark Twain wrote about Darjeeling. But Darjeeling was at 7,000 feet. And so the air was clean, it was cool, like I said, my father and the GIs were operating in what they called a malarial plain, right there. And so they'd go up to Darjeeling, get a couple days rest, be able to come back. A couple of pictures of Darjeeling. That's what Darjeeling looked like downtown. That's a Muslim monastery in the bottom there. These are a couple Hindi, probably Nepalese Hindi party goers. And the other place they could get to easily, my dad's battalion could get there very easily, was Calcutta, because they had the broad gauge service down to Calcutta. And he writes about perils, and this is where he learned to love fried shrimp. So the GIs had certain places they could go, and other places that were off limits, right? You couldn't go to certain parts, but they were allowed to be in perils, and that was an authorized place to eat. Now, here's a street performer in India. You see the snake, and you see the mongoose. So the performer is begging for money, and then he's going to turn these two beastlers on each other. Okay? Well, according to the caption in the photograph, he did that, but they didn't care. There's your snake charmer and a couple of GIs that are going to get their noses bit. Again, this is all in Calcutta. This lady is putting cow dung on a wall to dry, because in Calcutta, they use the cow dung to heat the house and to cook with. And that's why a lot of the descriptions of Calcutta talk about a pall over the city as you approach, because the smoke was all from using cow manure. And the Indians were, they were entrepreneurial, you know, so you'd have somebody go get a tiger cub, and then, you know, for a rupee, you'd be able to get your picture taken with the tiger cub. This is Matty Appel getting his picture taken there. So when my dad got to India, he made $158 a week, or excuse me, a month, as a married staff sergeant. He wrote my mom, "I'll need $5 a month here. The rest of it you can buy bombs with." And so they sent it home, paid the expenses, and Dad lived on $5 a month in India. And there's a little booklet that they gave to the GIs, and it said specifically, don't talk about how much money you make, because over here you're a lord. You know, you are considered. Don't even talk to the British about it, because you're getting better pay than the British officers are getting paid. So the other location that they would go for rest was down in Madras. Madras was the oldest British city in India. And there were pools and swimming and just lazy time to be had by all. Now, the other rest and relaxation happened on the base and was part of the USO system. So I asked these guys, I said, of all these different concerts and people who came by, who were your favorites? And they, oh yeah, no, Lillipons and Kostelantis. And of course, Lillipons was the opera diva. She was New York Opera's top star. And Kostelantis, her husband, was the conductor of the orchestra. And they loved the performance. And this was the orchestra of the unit there. And this guy over here, Tom Foltz, was the guy who gave me this photograph. So there's their theater. That may have been the old theater. It may have burned with the camp. But they had a theater. And then I asked him, okay, because they got first-run movies. It was just like, my dad could see almost the same thing that my mom saw in Indianapolis, and they'd write about movies. What do you think was the favorite movie of the GIs while they were there?
Casablanca?
You know, that probably would have been my guess. That would have been a little bit earlier. We'll keep you guessing.
Yeah.
National Guard. That's these big, tough GI railroaders, you know, they're all sitting around crying their faces out at National Guard. So. Now, I'm sorry I'm taking so long here, but we're going to talk about taking Burma back, which was a huge military operation. This General Slim was easily in the top 5 generals of the war. So to take Burma back, after they got their supply network set up, you had to Slim was here in Imphal, India. He was going to have to invade Burma, basically. To do that, you got to cross two rivers, Chinlen and the Irrawaddy. The Japanese defended the Chinlen. They really defended the Irrawaddy. And then, of course, you're going to come across, you're going to go down and get Mandalay, and then eventually get Rangoon. The headline here, better than a Goatly, means that this looks like a wooden boat to me. A Goatly was a canvas boat, so as these British and Indian and Nepalese troops went across these rivers, and the Irrawaddy was over a mile wide where these guys were going. They had to do it in a canvas boat. There's a vignette in the book that's based on fact. All the vignettes in the book are based on fact. They actually happened. The words may be mine, but the events all happened. Those canvas boats, of course, they could get ripped into shreds by submerged stumps and anything floating down the river, let alone Japanese firepower. So they came down through Mandalay, British troops fighting their way, Indian troops here, and they had a light armor component. And General Slim had decided that he was going to take Rangoon by the monsoon on May 15th. The monsoon came early that year. So he got within 30 miles of Rangoon. Of course, Rangoon's important because that's the seaport, right? That's where you can get your freight in and move it on up. And so he got bogged down. Well, the British were doing overflights in Rangoon, and they saw this. Japs gone, extract digit. This is the jail in Rangoon. They didn't believe it. They had their aircraft carrier, troop carriers out in the bay. They were going to come ashore. They're going to bomb the hell out of it, come ashore, take Rangoon. So they sent in one pilot in a Mosquito, which is a little canvas wood British bomber. It must have been the last Mosquito because those things didn't last very long in Burma. And the guy landed and tore up the airplane, but he and the co-pilot got out. They got an ox cart down into Rangoon. They went to this jail, and they got the story. There's 3,000 Allied prisoners in that jail. The Japanese had left a note, and when a prisoner got up to use the latrine in nighttime, he found a note on the mirror that said, "You're welcome to all the food stocks left, and we look forward to meeting you again on the field of battle." The Japanese had left because Komuro had left. Komuro never gave an order to leave Rangoon. He just left. And the other commander said, "If he's out here, I'm out of here," because the handwriting was on the wall. So Komuro and the troops all, for the Japanese, all tried to go east. And of course, eventually Slim and those troops track them down, and basically they annihilate the force that was in Japan, or in Burma. And does anybody want to take a guess what extract digit means in British airman slang? It means, you've heard people say, get your thumb. Yeah. All right, so I end it this way. This is a debatable 1940 or 42 Ford. I was corrected by an individual who says it's a 42. My dad, in the letters, I swear, said it was a 40. The reason why that I end it this way is Dad and Mom wrote a lot about this car. They wrote a lot about this little dog named Dutch. And when Dad leaves India, he leaves on a hardship discharge because his grandfather had passed away. My great-grandfather had been railroading till he was 74 years old and dies of liver cancer. So you've got my great-grandmother, my two grandparents, my mother, and the 4 teenage daughters living in a house in Indianapolis. Everybody's working, but it's hard, right? So Dad gets a hardship discharge virtually the week that they drop the bomb. So Dad comes home ahead of the rest of the battalion. And then he musters out in September, he musters out at Camp Atterbury in Indianapolis. And so Mom would have driven down from Indianapolis, or in Indiana, I should say. Mom would have driven down from Indianapolis in this and brought Dutch. And so the final slide right here is a Saturday Evening Post depiction. You see the GI kissing the soil as he gets on. The GIs would have been back by Christmas 1945, most of them. And I appreciate all the time. I'm sorry, I probably went a little bit longer. I didn't quite get on my game.